So some implications of everyday democracy. The first is that democracy isn't just about voting. It's about much, much more than that. So we need to find new ways to engage the public in collective decision-making on their own terms. So not starting with public sector organisations, because public sector organisations think in terms of budgets and policies and thickets of acronyms, of CDRPs and LSPs. The public just doesn't understand it. We need to go out and talk to the public on the public's terms about the things that worry them, and we need to be able to respond to that as public servants. We also need to find new ways to get the public to take voluntary action to tackle social and environmental problems. We need to get a politics of behaviour which is able to influence the public in a consensual way to make positive choices that add up to the common good. And as I mentioned earlier, that means the capacity and the legitimacy of government and of public service institutions is intrinsically and inextricably linked to government's ability to engage with its citizens. But it also means, and you guys know this better than I do, that it's not all about government. Actually, government's not the only organisation that can deliver everyday democracy. Public goods are increasingly delivered by a very wide range of actors. Businesses do it, the voluntary sector does it. In fact, the voluntary sector is very good at it. The voluntary sector is almost everyday democracy incarnate, because every day it involves people in making choices that add up to the common good in a voluntary way. And of course the social enterprise sector, which is becoming much more important in the UK debate. All of those organisations, all sectors, provide opportunities for engaging people in democratic consensual action. And I think what's useful about the concept of public value, that some of you might have come across, is that public value gives us a framework for thinking about how we actually engage the public, how we get organisations, no matter what sector they're in, to deliver public goods. So public value is really a way of thinking about how we deliver public services, no matter who's doing it. And public value in its simplest is the idea that public services exist to deliver what the public values. So public value is what the public values, which is somewhat tautological, but bear with me. What it means is that we need to engage deeply with citizens and continually to find out what they want and to reshape our organisations around their needs. And to discuss those needs and to refine those needs, of course. This isn't just about pure populism. But it also recognises that the public doesn't just value receiving a service. They don't just value what they directly get from the public sector. They're not quite that selfish about it. They value better services, of course they do. And they do value what they get, but they also value trust. They want to be able to trust the public sector. They value legitimacy, the sense that they've been involved in decisions, the sense that the public sector has listened to them, the sense that it has their mandate. They value that about it. And they value fairness. They value a sense that the public sector is delivering something fairly to all the people in their area. The sense that actually the public sector isn't just about a consumer relationship, but is about improving society, and that it has distinctive public values. And actually I've been doing some research recently on trust in public services, and it's really, that research has really borne this out. People do have that wider sense of the value of the public sector that goes beyond a simple consumer relationship. And there are just two neat quotes that really sum that up for me here. One is from the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, David Aubrey's old employer. And they say that in a democracy, value is ultimately defined by the public themselves. Value is determined by citizens' preferences, it's expressed through a variety of means, and it's refracted through the decisions of elected politicians. And the second is Tom Bentley, who's our former director here, who says that progress in a post-political age depends not primarily on the design or management of institutions, but on the way in which they draw on and interact with the people they serve. Again, coming back to that notion that engaging with the public is the key to what David called phase 3 of public service reform in the UK. So, public-private partnerships. This really builds on some of the stuff that you've just heard David say around where we are now with public-private partnerships. The question that I wanted to ask was, can the private sector, can our current models of working with the private sector deliver everyday democracy, as I've just described it to you? And the answer is that actually the potential, I think at the moment, for the private sector to deliver everyday democracy is extremely limited. And it's limited by 3 key factors. One is that procurement practices, the way the public sector buys services, really place the emphasis on efficiency and target meeting. There's very little space in most of those contracts for engagement and democracy. In fact, the only contract I've seen that involves really any focus on the public is one that Serco have in Wokingham, which is out in the southeast. and part of their profit is linked to whether or not they can improve measures of customer satisfaction. Now, that's not bad, but it's hardly engagement. It's still really, can we just make people feel more satisfied with their bin collection? But still, it's a start, but it's the only contract I've seen that involves really any kind of accountability downward to the citizens who are being served. Because actually, and this brings me on to my second point, most of these contracts involve a private sector organisation looking upwards all the time to the public sector authority that hired them. It's local government, it's me as Serco, all the time saying, am I hitting the target the council set me? Is the council happy? Which is fine, provided that the council is doing all the engagement, has set the right targets, etc., etc. But what it means that if I'm Serco, I have no incentive really to engage, to talk to the people I'm serving. I don't get paid for it, I don't get any benefit from it, so why would I do it? Another issue is innovation. When the public sector lets a contract, what it's usually looking for is a service that's a bit better and a bit cheaper, but basically looks like the service it's already delivering. So there's very little room for innovation. And once the contract's signed, there's hardly any room for innovation. It's very hard, once contracts are signed, for the private sector to actually do anything different, because they've got to meet their targets in the contract all the time. So my contention really is that it's not that there's something intrinsic about business that means that the private sector can't deliver everyday democracy. I don't think that's true at all. But I think that the way we use the private sector at the moment, and I think actually the way that the private sector often wants to be used, is very simple, very clear targets, not really involving the kind of complexity that would have to be involved in delivering more democracy to the people who use services. So my conclusion is that being a business isn't enough. And actually this came through very much when I spoke to some of your colleagues last week. People were saying, we see ourselves as a business. That's what we want to be, we operate in the market. I'm not sure that when you're working in the public sphere that being a business is enough. In fact, I'm certain it's not enough. Businesses and markets are about shareholder value, not public value. So if you want to be a business that delivers public value, how can you do that? Well, here are 3 principles that might help. One is engagement. So actually, how do we get beyond just delivering targets and contract goals? And how do businesses start engaging in much more deep and realistic ways with the people that they serve, particularly to engage them in co-production, particularly to encourage them to recycle, to take control of some of their own assets, their parks, their libraries? How do we engage people as active partners in delivering public services? Collaboration is another one. The private sector is pretty awful at working with other bits of the public sector. If I hire Serco to come and pick up my bins, the chances are Serco won't work with anyone else who's doing other bits of work in the local area. So we need to persuade the private sector somehow to collaborate more effectively with other bits of the local public sector. Because again, that's the only way we can focus the whole of the public sector on those big, multi-causal, complex problems that David was talking about, like crime. And finally, innovation. I'm not sure what the answer is to this, but we need to find much more radical ways of pushing the private sector to be more innovative. The private sector will always say, what we're good at is innovating. That's why you should hire us, we'll be innovative. Actually, in most cases, in my experience in the public sector, they're really not terribly innovative. So how can the public sector challenge people in business much more? How can it say, don't just deliver a bit better and a bit cheaper, give us a lot better and a bit cheaper, or give us the same and much cheaper. Show us new ways of delivering, inject new approaches. A good example of how that might work is our organisations called tenant management organisations, which were set up in the early 1990s to allow people living on public housing estates to take over the management of their housing and their local services. And what's good about those contracts is they essentially, those boards of tenants have a budget, they hire the private sector to help deliver their services, and then they just do it in dialogue. There aren't those kind of performance targets in quite the same way. They just say, okay, well look, we want this improved, how are you going to do that within the budget? And it creates a trusting relationship, it creates a dialogue, it creates a demand for innovation from the people living on the estate, saying, okay, we've got so much money, but we want you to do this much better. So, thank you for listening. There's some more on this on our website, which is there, and obviously if you have any more questions after the session, that's my email address. But with that, I'm done, and I'll hand you over to Charlie Leadbeater.